Hi everyone, this is Amy from the North Columbus Public Library, and thank you so much for joining us today. We have a special presentation and several guest speakers today. And today we are actually celebrating the 19th Amendment. 2020 marks the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And we have several, again, guest speakers that I'm going to introduce to you today surrounding this centennial. First, we have Rebecca Bush. She is the Curator of History and Exhibitions Manager at the Columbus Museum. Since arriving in Columbus in 2011, a partial list of her accomplishments include exhibitions on the Jewish heritage of the Chattahoochee Valley, the enslaved autistic musician Blind Tom Wiggins, the desegregation of the local public library system, and Southern Gothic author Carson McCullers. She earned a BA in History from Kansas State University and an MA in Public History from the University of South Carolina. Rebecca is the co-editor and contributing author to Art and Public History, Approaches, Opportunities, and Challenges, and her article about interpreting the life of Carson McCullers and Gertrude Mulroney appeared in the Public Historian. Her most recent exhibition is And So She Did, Women of the Chattahoochee Valley, which is now on view at the Columbus Museum. Thank you, Rebecca. And also I'm going to introduce to Emily. Emily Cruz is the Outreach Librarian for Columbus State University, and she has done a ton of great projects for CSU libraries, and we've actually even collaborated together last year for Banned Book Week. And we had lots of, that was a very rewarding experience as well. So, but I want to go ahead and pass off now the mic to Rebecca Bush. She's going to tell us a little bit more about women's history and the 19th Amendment. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks so much to Amy and the North Columbus Public Library and Chattahoochee Valley Libraries for having me as a speaker today. I'm really excited to speak about the women's suffrage movement, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to give a brief overview of the American women's suffrage movement with some special focus on Georgia and Columbus. We're just going to scratch the surface today, but there have been a lot of great programs that have happened this year, particularly in March during Women's History Month and also during August when we celebrated the final ratification and adoption of the 19th Amendment. And I know that Amy and Emily are also going to talk about some other great programs and give some book recommendations as well. So there's lots of great resources out there to learn more. But for now, we'll go ahead and get started. So the women's suffrage movement begins in earnest in the U.S. in the 1840s, actually because of an event that happens in London, which is an anti-slavery convention. One of the things we'll learn as we go through the program today is that the women's suffrage movement and the movement for the abolition of slavery were connected from the very beginning. And in 1840, there was an anti-slavery convention that took place in London, and Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker preacher, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was at that point a young woman but very interested in the abolition movement, were barred from attending that convention strictly because they were women. And as you can imagine, that did not sit well with them, and so they began kind of discussing this amongst themselves and realizing that there were a lot of rights that men had in the Western world, in the UK and the US in particular, that women did not have. And they thought that just wasn't right. So in 1848, these women and others meet at Seneca Falls, New York, in what becomes known as the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention, if you've learned anything about women's suffrage in the 19th century, you've probably heard this term. You can see there it is mostly women who are assembled. There are also a few men who attend, and we'll talk about that in a second. Most famously from this convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton pens a Declaration of Sentiment, which really functions as a sort of Declaration of Independence for the women's suffrage and women's rights movement for the 70, 80 plus years that follow the Seneca Falls Convention. And the location of that convention is, you can actually go visit that now as a museum. During that convention, women speak. Lucretia Mott, who was revered for her oratory in Quaker churches, she speaks. Elizabeth Cady Stanton speaks. And we also have several prominent figures in the abolition movement, including William Lloyd Garrison, who's there on the right-hand side of your screen. And on the left, you probably recognize Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was the only African-American who was present at the Seneca Falls Convention. There were no Black women invited. This is kind of the very beginning of a racial rift in the women's suffrage movement in America that we'll talk more about as we go forward. But even though many of these women are very involved in the abolition movement, and these men are as well, unfortunately, this rift is kind of present from the beginning. By 1850, however, that's changed. And at that point, the first National Women's Rights Convention is held. And Sojourner Truth attends that. Sojourner Truth is one of the most amazing activists of the 19th century. She advocated for the abolition of slavery, also for women's rights. And in 1851, the following year at the National Women's Rights Convention, she gives a landmark speech, which has become known as Ain't I a Woman? And I want to play a portion of that for you. Now, unfortunately, in 1851, we did not have cameras or audio recordings, unfortunately. But I'd like to play a clip of the Georgia author Alice Walker reading Sojourner Truth's words.
Where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think betwixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped in the carriages and lifted over ditches, and they have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me in the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could hit me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. Intellect. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black thing, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Your Christ come from? From God and a woman. deal with it. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now that they's asking to do it, the men better let them.
I love that speech. Those are obviously really powerful words. Also, a lot of humor, as Alice Walker really wonderfully brings out. I think it really helps give us a feel for the personality of these people from the past. Unfortunately, as we know, it takes much longer for most Black women in America to truly have the right to vote. But Sojourner Truth, a very important early voice in that fight. So since the women's suffrage movement was so tied to the abolition movement, somewhat understandably for that reason and for other reasons as well, the women's suffrage movement sort of takes a back seat during the Civil War. As the nation is engulfed in war and ultimately enslaved people in the South and in states that stayed in the Union are freed as a result of the Civil War. So in 1866, the fight begins anew, and it begins with some new faces and some familiar ones as well. So on the left of the screen, you may recognize this image. It's quite well known. We have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is now an older woman, and she is with Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was not involved in the women's suffrage movement for the Civil War, but immediately afterwards, she becomes really the leader of that movement and is probably best associated with it. She is on our coinage. If you can find a Susan B. Anthony coin, really a landmark figure in the American women's suffrage movement. You also have then on the right, that's an image of Carrie Chapman Catt, who is a bit lesser known than these other two ladies, but she really plays a key role in the decades immediately leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then really helps encourage women to register to vote and to lead efforts to help women really get involved in voting and electoral politics once the vote is won. So some of the key figures of this new movement to know here. In 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony found a new Women's Suffrage Association, which is a national association. There is a competing association that is formed later, and essentially the difference in those two organizations is their approach to strategy, whether they are going to take a federal approach and advocate for a national amendment to the Constitution, or whether they're going to take a state-by-state approach, because states did have the right to individually empower women to vote, and some of those states did, which we'll talk about. Now, you may have heard back in August, on August 18th, which was the anniversary of Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment, which helped it reach the 3/4 majority of states it needed at the time to fully go into effect. You may have heard that President Trump was pardoning Susan B. Anthony. And you might be thinking, wait, Susan B. Anthony was arrested? What was she doing? Tell me more about that. So just wanted to give a little context to that. In 1872, 1874, in 1874, Susan B. Anthony makes a, 1872. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony makes a move to vote in the presidential election in Rochester, New York. She knew that that would be an illegal action and that it is likely she would be arrested. She was arrested and she gave a defense of herself, but at her trial, a judge directed a jury to return a guilty verdict without any deliberation at all. And before giving her sentence, the judge asked Anthony whether she had anything to say, and she delivered what's one of the most famous speeches in the history of the women's suffrage movement. Most notably, she said that her trial had, quote, trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. She furthermore said that she had been denied justice under, quote, forms of law, all made by men, failing even to get a trial by a jury, not of my peers, which is a really interesting statement. The right to trial by a jury of our peers is one of the cornerstones of the American judicial system. But discriminations against people on the basis of race and gender have really tested what that peer group looks like in the American justice system. And so her calling that out is especially interesting. So on the one hand, should Susan B. Anthony be pardoned? Well, on the one hand, yes, because what she did was no longer a crime. We would never think of stopping someone from voting today simply because that person is a woman. And so in that way, it's a very obvious choice. But there were some scholars who also pointed out that it's very possible that Susan B. Anthony herself would not want it to have been officially pardoned for her crime because she did not accept the supposition that she had committed a crime in the first place. This actually became the cornerstone of several speeches that she gave after the fact, such as this one where she said, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution, beyond the power of any state to deny. So I think that's some interesting context, just to give you a little bit more about what her crime was and how she herself felt about it. So the women's suffrage movement continues through the late 19th century until we get to 1890. And that's really a watershed year for the movement. There's lots of smaller landmarks in between, but 1890 is so notable for a number of reasons. For one thing, those two national organizations I mentioned earlier, they finally decide to merge and they create the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In case you're wondering, one of them used to have national at the front, the other one used to have American at the front of their respective names. So by combining the two organizations, you put two, so that's how you end up with what kind of sounds slightly repetitive to our ears. But the National American Women's Suffrage Association, also known as NASA. The movement ultimately chooses to focus on securing suffrage rights at the state level at that point, and they have their first success in 1890 when Wyoming is admitted to the Union with a state constitution that guarantees women's suffrage. Now, there are a number of states in the West who, when they were organized as territories, included in their territorial constitutions the right for women to vote. And after Wyoming becomes the first state to give women the right to vote, there are several other Western states that follow. You see this image here of women in an Eastern city that says, we're voters out West. Why deny our rights in the East? And there's several interesting reasons for why the West was a leader in this effort. And part of it, as you might imagine, was to attract women to move to Western states. There were a lot of men who moved west looking for either land to homestead, or perhaps they were looking for opportunities to mine, or just opportunities for a fresh start. And they vastly outnumbered women in all of these new states and territories. So Many of the newly elected male representatives for these areas thought that by giving women the right to vote in their state, they might attract a few adventurous folks who might want to move out west rather than stay in the east where they did not have the right. One of the other key moments that happens in 1890 is the founding of the Georgia Woman Suffrage Association, and that happens right here in Columbus. So in this point in our story, we come to the Howard sisters, not quite the Schuyler sisters from Hamilton, but certainly a force in their own right. And the leader of our story here is Helen Augusta Howard, whose picture is in the center there. She's born in 1865 to a wealthy Columbus family, and when she is still a girl, her father passes away. And as she and her sisters and her brothers grow up and help their mother, they realize that even though their mother is still responsible for all of their father's debts and that she must pay taxes to the state for property and for debts related to his business interests, that she really has no say in how those tax laws or how any of his business interests, how any of it really is regulated, because she doesn't have the opportunity to vote for representatives for the state legislature or for Congress for that matter. And so Augusta's mother and her sisters and Augusta really begin to think and talk about amongst themselves how unfair this is. It really seems to them like another example of taxation without representation, which is the rallying cry that started the Revolutionary War. So in 1890, Augusta, her mother, and her sisters found the Georgia Woman Suffrage Association, which becomes the state chapter of NASA. And so here pictured as well, we have Claudia Howard Maxwell, we have Miriam Howard DuBose, but most of all, we have Augusta. Augusta is a fascinating figure. She's one of the most fascinating figures in Columbus history to me. She is considered quite scandalous by several people in Columbus society, because even though she came from a wealthy family, she did not follow many of the rules of polite society that she would have been expected to follow. She never married. She was a vegetarian. She was an atheist and at times dabbled in spiritualism. She believed in women's right to vote. And she also, on occasion, wore pants, which is probably the most scandalous thing she could have done. She didn't always wear pants, however, and the dress that you can see on your screen is actually a dress that she wore at the National American Woman Suffrage Convention that took place in Atlanta in 1895. At that meeting, she's just 30 years old, but she and her sisters had helped convince the national organization to hold their convention in Atlanta the previous year, making the argument that even though Southern women were not as active in the suffrage movement at the national level, there were still many who were involved, and that there were many people in the South who needed to hear this message of women's suffrage. So she wears this dress at the convention in Atlanta. Afterwards, she brings Susan B. Anthony back to Columbus to speak. Susan B. Anthony was here in our community and spoke. She stays with Augusta Howard at her family's home on called Sherwood Hall, which is no longer standing, but it was out on Talbotton Road. And so Augusta is really a key early figure, a leader in Georgia in the 1890s. However, her brothers, because she is unmarried, her brothers control her financial reality and her access to the family's money. And they really come to dislike how much of a name she's making for herself and these controversial positions that she's pushing. And so they ultimately cut her off. They severely limit her access to money, so she can't really travel anymore. And unfortunately, she really fades out of the women's suffrage movement at that point. There is a fascinating postscript to her story about 20 or so years later. At that point, she is living as a recluse in the family home. There is a young boy who worked in a mill who walked by, started climbing one of the trees on her property, and she fired a gun at him in his direction, she said, as a warning shot. Unfortunately, the warning shot hit him. He fell out of the tree and walked home bleeding. He was ultimately okay, but Augusta Howard was put on trial for shooting him. During that trial, she really does herself no favors. She gets on the stand and gives a 3-hour defense of herself, in which she partially talks about how mean her brothers have been to her, how they have shut her away and truly been cruel to her. But she also talks about how she is from one of the most respected families in Columbus, and no one should dare treat her this way because she is such a well-respected woman of the community, and just comes across as very unsympathetic. The jury, again, not truly a jury of her peers, finds her guilty. And then we get to a really interesting twist in this story. Her brothers are horrified that their sister has been convicted of an offense for which she's going to serve jail time. And so they begin a letter writing campaign to the governor of Georgia. They enlist all their wealthy friends and prominent influential businessmen to write letters arguing that Augusta is not in her right mind, and therefore her sentence should be commuted and she should be released to the care and custody of her brothers. Augusta, as you might imagine, is not thrilled at the prospect of being declared almost mentally insane. And so she mounts her own letter writing campaign with her friends in which they argue that she is not insane and therefore she should be made to serve her sentence, including jail time. Ultimately, her brothers and their friends win out. The governor commutes her sentence and she is released from jail. She is spirited away by her brothers to live in New York City, where she dies in 1934. She is buried in Linwood Cemetery in Columbus, however, and I really encourage you to go check out her tombstone sometime. Her friends raised money for it. And so with her name and her life and death dates, it has a kind of a brief summary of her activism. And then at the very bottom in big block letters, it says martyred. So her friends clearly felt that although she was not literally killed for her beliefs, that her brother's stifling of her spirit really killed her activism and the impact that she was having in the women's suffrage movement. So really a great and fascinating story. And this dress is on view right now in the Columbus Museum's Women's History exhibition if you'd like to come see it in person and look at those teeny tiny buttons. Another suffragist with connections to our region was Adella Hunt Logan. Adella Hunt came from Sparta, Georgia. She ultimately ends up marrying a man who is an instructor at the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, and she lives there with him and is an instructor there at Tuskegee. Adella Hunt Logan was a biracial woman, and she was so light that she could actually pass as a white woman in many circumstances. This allowed her, when she became involved in the women's suffrage movement, to be able to travel places safely that were not open to many other African American suffragists. She could ride in white train cars and potentially attend conventions that were not open to Black women at that time. Susan B. Anthony once made the remark that Adella Hunt Logan's story was somewhat tragic because even though she lived her life as an African American woman, as was considered to be African American, that she was just purely by her skin tone it was lighter than a lot of the women who did have access to these white suffrage conventions and some other protections that were being afforded to white women at that point. So just really pointing out the hypocrisy and the nonsensical manner of many of the rules and understandings and laws about race in this country. Adella Hunt Logan not only attended conventions, she spoke several places. She wrote several editorials for The Crisis, which was the highly influential national magazine of the NAACP. Her story, unfortunately, really ends in tragedy. She dies by suicide when she jumps off a roof at Tuskegee while she's still a relatively young woman. So hers is definitely a story of promise unfulfilled, but certainly a landmark, influential woman whose words are well worth reading and appreciating. Elsewhere in Georgia, I wanted to talk a little bit about Rebecca Latimer Felton. There are several women who are involved in the women's suffrage movement who become better known than Augusta Howard as we get closer to the passage of the 19th Amendment. And one of those women is Rebecca Latimer Felton. Her sister, Mary Latimer McLendon, was also very involved, but Rebecca Felton is particularly notable because she becomes the very first woman to serve in the US Senate. And there's a little bit of an asterisk beside that. So I just want to give you some backstory on that. In 1922, the senator from Georgia, Thomas Watson, died. Now, the Georgia governor, Thomas Hardwick, needed to appoint a replacement to serve until a special election could be held. However, he realized that because Senator Watson had died while Congress was not in session, the special election would be held before Congress ever went back into session. So the appointee, though someone had to be legally appointed, that person would never truly meaningfully serve in Congress. Hardwick wanted to become a senator himself, and he realized that whoever he appointed would naturally have a leg up in any special election that took place. So instead of appointing someone who might have been considered by the Georgia electorate to be a real opponent to Hardwick, he chose to appoint Rebecca Latimer Felton as the next senator from Georgia. Ultimately, Hardwick's play doesn't even pay off for him. He loses that special election to Walter F. George. If you've gone down south of here a little bit, you recognize Lake Walter F. George. This is the man who it's named for. So Hardwick isn't even successful in his attempt to become a senator from Georgia. But Rebecca Latimer Felton does go to Washington, D.C. to Congress. She is sworn in at noon on November 21st, 1922. And the next morning, she made a speech thanking the Senate for allowing her to be sworn in and noting that the women who followed her would serve with ability, integrity of purpose, and unstinted usefulness. And I have a short clip of her here as an elderly woman, which I just want to play. I think it's great to hear her speak a little bit about her life.
Are you feeling good this morning? Hope you do. I'm trying to get on my feet again. Feel pretty good. Thankful it's as well as it is. Oh, boys, I'm pleased to see you. I don't know where you come from, but I give you all the welcome I've got to offer you. And I want to tell you that I'm living on the same ground that I've been on for 75 long years when I come here as an 18-year-old bride. I went to Washington 50 years and a little more ago. I saw all the people around there, one with the president. And I learned many things up there that before. I'll add a little more to it.
She speaks for a little bit longer. That's a clip that's just openly available on YouTube. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to go ahead and look that up on your own. African American women also play a key role in the women's suffrage movement. Two of the best known figures were Mary Church Terrell, who you can see there on the left. She helped found a national organization for African American women's clubs, who were very involved in uplift and service opportunities for Black communities within their hometowns. But many of those clubs also participated in the women's suffrage movement. We also see on the right there, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who is probably actually best known as being a pioneering journalist, publishing searing exposés on lynchings in the South and really calling the nation's attention to those horrific acts. But she was also involved in the women's suffrage movement. We're going to jump ahead a little bit to 1913, which is notable both locally and nationally. In 1913, all those years after Augusta Howard first founded a Women's Suffrage Association from Columbus, the Muskogee Equal Franchise League is founded, which is a specifically Columbus-based women's suffrage organization. They began publishing regular columns in the Columbus newspapers. They even organized a special women's suffrage edition of the newspaper in 1914. And also at that time, there was probably the best known March for Women's Suffrage, which takes place in Washington, D.C. And so you can see on the screen here, I really like this image. It's very well known. You see, first of all, the purple and gold and white, which are the colors that American suffragists really adopted for themselves. You see that repeated a lot in their clothing and sashes. And you also see kind of the ornamentation and the pageantry of this march. So here you see some women. There are some walking down the street with flags. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, you see some women on horseback. You also see women who adopt costumes such as Columbia, which would have been a very familiar kind of female avatar for the country of the United States and America at that time. You have someone writing as Joan of Arc as well. So really calling back these really heroic classical heroines that would be familiar to Americans at that time. We also know that there is at least one native of Columbus who participated in that march. Winona Cargyle was born here in Columbus. We don't know much about her early life, except that her father was a minister at an AME church here in Columbus. By the time Winona is a teenager, she and her family had moved to Macon, where she graduated from high school before she went on to attend Howard University. While she's at Howard, she becomes one of the founding members of the historically Black sorority Delta Sigma Theta. And that founding group of women marched in this Women's Suffrage March in Washington, D.C. in 1913. There aren't really great pictures of them doing so. They were forced to be at the back of the march, unfortunately, but they were there and present. And really just another great visual example of the role that Black women play in securing women the right to vote in America. By 1917, women's suffrage activists are turning to more dramatic tactics. We have the founding of the National Women's Party with its leader, Alice Paul, who you can see here. And she really takes inspiration from suffragettes in England, who, as they are protesting, are choosing to be arrested and go to jail for their cause. In June of 1917, members of the National Women's Party begin picketing outside the White House. They're sentenced to up to 6 months in jail. Eventually, many of these women, including Alice Paul, go on hunger strikes. They are force-fed And news reports of their treatment really generate a lot of attention. People are horrified at the idea of these women being jailed and being force-fed. It really starts to turn the national conversation about women's suffrage. World War I is also a key part in that. Though the war began in 1914, America does not enter until 1917. And at that time, as many young men go off to war, a lot of women start to take over men's roles, especially in manufacturing and in the workplace. We really think about that happening a lot during World War II, but it happens for the first time during World War I. And so this really becomes a rallying cry for a lot of women. You see advertisements like this one: "We are ready to work beside you, fight beside you, and die beside you. Let us vote beside you." So really making the argument that if a woman is good enough and skilled enough and qualified enough to make vital equipment for the war effort, surely she is qualified enough to vote. Again, as a war measure, the country is asking of women's service, and all these different jobs, women are asking of the country the vote. That's it. That's the great singular item there with all that blank space around it. It also, on the right there, you see appeals for the sacrifices that women are making from an emotional standpoint as well. Women are frequently nurses. They are trained by the Red Cross. They are leading home canning efforts and rationing efforts. They are watching their sons and brothers and husbands and other loved ones and friends go off to war. And so really see this argument building: why are we not good enough to receive the vote? Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson comes to their side and really urges the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so in the summer of 1919, Congress passes the 19th Amendment, which is known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And it says that no person, no United States citizen can be denied the right to vote on the basis of sex. It then goes to the states for ratification, which takes about a year. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee becomes the final state necessary to ratify the 19th Amendment, and it is officially adopted by Congress as part of the U.S. Constitution on August 26, 1920. There are celebrations all over the country. And in the United States, Virginia Causey, in her great history of Columbus, Red Clay, Whitewater, and Blues, recounts that the Muskogee Equal Franchise League asked churches, factories, and railroads here in Columbus to sound bells and whistles at noon on August 28th to salute women's right to vote. But the city was quiet, leading League President Anna Griffin to claim that the suffragists were treated like snakes in Ireland. Unfortunately, women in Georgia still could not vote in 1920, as the registration deadline for the 1920 elections had already passed and the state of Georgia refused to extend it so that women could register. So at that point, the Equal Suffrage League locally turns into the League of Women Voters. And on January 18, 1921, Muskogee County finally began accepting registrations from women. The League requested that each woman who registered pick up a sticker for her window. "A woman in this house has registered to vote," thereby assuming the responsibilities of citizenship. In September 1921, the women of Columbus are the deciding factor in moving Columbus to a new form of government, away from an alderman system to a city commission system with the hiring of a professional city manager for the first time. It had previously been on the ballot twice and failed to pass. In September 1921, 82% of women who vote in that election vote in favor of a commission system of government. So it finally passes in November 1921. Anna Griffin becomes the first woman city commissioner. She's elected to serve on that very first city commission. There's a really great piece here that talks about the new Columbus, the women's suffrage movement, and the formation of that new city commission that Anna Griffin writes about. Unfortunately, she only serves in office for 2 years. She ends up being on the wrong side of male public opinion in a controversial court case, and when she is up for re-election, even though 70% of women vote for her, the vast majority of men vote against her. It's not until 1978 that Columbus women are again represented on the Columbus City Commission by Edna Kendrick. And in 1984, the first African-American woman is elected to the city council, Rose Strong. And just to wrap up our story, Georgia did eventually ratify the 19th Amendment in 1970. So it took us a little while, and we know that we still have a long ways to go, and a lot of respects in how we preserve the right to vote and help people get out the vote. But women continue to persevere, both locally and throughout Georgia and the United States. And I just want to conclude today by encouraging folks to check out the museum's new exhibition, and so she did, Women of the Chattahoochee Valley. Talks about women's suffrage, women in local politics, and a whole lot more. It'll be on view until January 10th. The museum is open with mask and social distancing requirements in effect, so we invite you to come by. We have free admission. And if you're still not comfortable going out of the house right now, you can go to columbusmuseum.com. You can go to the exhibition's webpage, the full link of which is there on your screen. And you can see a virtual tour of the exhibition, and you can see links to a couple of different programs that we've previously done with lots of great women talking about the women's suffrage movement and women's history here locally. So with that, I'm going to turn the program back over to talk about some great book recommendations and other programs coming up.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Emily. That's awesome. I learned so much, and it was a great refresher too, just because it had been a while since I had studied history myself, and I just love it, and I can't wait to check out the exhibit. I have looked a little bit of what's available on the Columbus Museum website, and I'm going to definitely in the meantime take that virtual tour. And I know that I've also seen some of your other programs. In fact, there was one last week that I watched that I really enjoyed. So thank you so much for that. And it was actually on the historic marker, which is I'm so happy that we have in Columbus.
Yes, absolutely. That was a great program, and we had a great Columbus native, Sylvia Marshall, sharing with us, and then Elizabeth Barker and the Historic Columbus team helped unveil that marker. So if folks want to take a field trip, go downtown to the Government Center and check it out.
Most definitely. Thank you. And now I'm going to pass it off to Emily. And Emily, you're more than welcome to if you have any questions or comments for Rebecca. And also, we'd love to hear what CSU libraries are doing. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. First of all, that presentation was amazing. There's so much stuff that I learned. So at CSU libraries, we've also done exhibits not as maybe dynamic as the Columbus museums. Okay, so with the help of the theater department, we've made a replica of 19th Amendment, suffragettes costume. So this is a picture of our whole display, and this was put together by Jessie Merrill in the CSU archives. She did all of our signage. So this banner is a replica of one created by the National Association of Colored Women League. They were founded in 1896, and they discussed civil rights and women's suffrage. It was the only example of an African American woman's group banner that we could find. We definitely wanted to include it because it's so important. Okay. And this is a replica of a banner that Rebecca spoke about from a picket in 1917. Okay. So, and as part of our COVID-19 precautions, the CSU library is currently only available to students and faculty and staff, but we will be making a digital version of this exhibit so it can be enjoyed by the whole community. Okay, so and coming up in September we have Constitution Day. So this year we're going to focus on the 19th Amendment and disenfranchised voters. So, how, not all voters are still free to are free to vote. And then later on in October, the whole month of October, we're going to be doing a voters pledge drive. It'll actually be open to the public. We're hoping for people to pledge to vote in honor of these women who fought so hard for our right to vote. And there will be giveaways and prizes, and so that's what we have planned.
That's awesome,
really exciting, Emily.
Thank you.
And I'd like to also brag a little bit too. I know Emily actually made the banner that goes across.
Oh.
She made that.
I did. It was very exciting. Yeah, so my sewing skills were put to the test. And one of the things we're going to be giving away are little buttons and stuff. So I learned the meaning of the different colors. So this is quote that I read. It was written in 1913. It says, "Purple is the color of loyalty, constancy to purpose, unswerving steadfastness to a cause. White is the emblem of purity, symbolizes the quality of our purpose, and gold, the color of light and life, is as the torch that guides our purpose, pure and unswerving." So you also see there's yellow roses were the symbol of one of the symbols of the suffrage movement. There's actually a song out there, you can look it up. It's called Anti-Suffragist Rose. So it's the red rose. So you think about that the next time you give out red roses to your loved ones.
Wow, I did not know all of those details. Thank you, Emily. That's wonderful. And Rebecca did have to leave us, but she's again, thank you, Rebecca, for all that you shared with us. We learned so much, and Emily and I are going to continue our discussion here for a little while. And Emily, thank you. This is awesome, and I can't wait to visit virtually the exhibit that was created, and all that y'all are doing there at CSU Libraries.
Yes.
And I'll go ahead and jump in here. And what I want to try to share my screen here right now is that behind me, I have there's two panels, and there will be some pictures in here, and I'll try to include images later and supplementary materials to this video. So about a year ago, it's actually been more than a year now, the National Archives has sent out this email to librarians and educators asking who would like this pop-up exhibit. And so I just thought, let me just put my name in the hat and just see if we are lucky enough to actually get one of these. And so I was completely shocked, and we got this pop-up exhibit. And I know that's not really easy to see, but I thought it would be a nice backdrop for this program that we're doing. So, but I have actually, let's see here. I have some pictures here I wanted to show everyone. And there we go. And can you see that all right, Emily?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So this is what it looks like out on the floor, and it's kind of rotated throughout the building. And we're at the North Branch Library. We're on Armour Road across from Britt David Park. And so currently the libraries are just offering, the public libraries in Columbus are offering curbside service. But some of you may have seen this before the COVID pandemic. So, and we will continue to have it for a while. And so this is the first side of the panel, and it's called Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote. Here is the second side of it, and the third portion, and this is the last side to it. And again, this was graciously donated, given to the library from the National Archives. And we're super excited. It's pretty wide and big. It's like 6 or 7 feet tall, and it's pretty wide too. So you can have a whole full circle experience around it too. So, and this is just a little display that I had set up for near it. And originally it was kind of near the front entrance where the checkout desk is, and but then COVID happened. So, but this is what some of the books. I mean, we have several books in our collection just on women's rights and the 19th Amendment, and I want to just talk about a few of them today that you can check out. So the first one, and I first heard about this book actually from PBS. PBS Books actually has their own Facebook group, and they had Elaine Weiss, the author, give a talk about this book, and I was instantly hooked. So it's called The Woman's Hour: The Great Fight to Win the Vote. So this is an uplifting account of the 1920 ratification of the constitutional amendment that granted voting rights to women, that traces the culmination of 7 decades of legal battles and cites the pivotal contributions of famous suffragists and political leaders. So this is available in print from the Chattahoochee Valley Library System, and so you can reserve it for curbside pickup. Next, I found another book. It's called To Joy My Freedom. It's the Southern Black Women's Lives and Labor After the Civil War, and it's by Tara W. Hunter. Tara Hunter follows African American working women from their newfound optimism and hope at the end of the Civil War, so this would be right after 1865, to their struggles as free domestic laborers in the homes of their former master. We witness their drive as they build neighborhoods and networks, and their energy as they enjoy leisure hours in dance halls and clubs. We learn of their militance and the way they resisted efforts to keep them economically depressed and medically victimized. Finally, we see the despair and defeat provoked by Jim Crow laws and segregation, and how they spurred large numbers of Black laboring women to migrate north. So this is a very enlightening book, especially on the historical context, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. Next, we have a book that's called Sisters and Rebels. It's a struggle for the soul of America by Jacqueline Dowd Hall. And this is a fairly new book. This traces the parallel lives of 3 Lumpkin sisters, describing how one remained a believer in the white supremacy culture of their Southern upbringing, while the others became progressive supporters of race and labor initiatives. There's much more to all of these books, but for the purposes of this presentation, I just gave a condensed version. But this is a highly interesting book, well researched. All of these books are, and I couldn't recommend them further. Next, there is The Secret History of Wonder Woman by Jill Lepore. It's a cultural history of Wonder Woman, which traces the character's creation and enduring popularity, drawing on interviews and archival research to reveal the pivotal role of feminism in shaping her 7-decade story, and which, as we all know, will continue to pass on. Wonder Woman has been such a huge icon for girls and women for many, many decades. And Rebecca actually mentioned this book, and this is written by CSU professor Virginia E. Causey. It's called Red Clay, White Water, and Blues. It's the history of Columbus, Georgia. And in here, Dr. Causey traces the life of Columbus, its founding and early boom years, Civil War, and aftermath conflicts in the modern city emerged in the first half of the 20th century, racial tensions and economic decline in the mid to late 1900s, and also the rebirth and revival of the cities in the 21st century. It's peppered throughout and are compelling anecdotes about the city's most colorful characters. And some of those do include the phenomenal Blind Tom Wiggins, suffragist Augusta Howard, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, and industrialist and philanthropist G. Gumby Jordan, peanut purveyor Tom Huston, and blueswoman Ma Rainey. And of course, novelist Carson McCullers and insurance magnate John Amos. And again, I'm actually stationed at the North Columbus Public Library. We have 4 branches in Columbus, and we're the one that's on Armour Road, right across from Britt David Park. And we are offering curbside services every day from 10 to 6, on Thursdays from 10 to 8, and we're closed on Sunday. And you can always sign up for an e-library card through the website, or you can always call us there at the number if you have any questions about our services or how you would like to request books or any questions that you may have. And here are some additional resources. Of course, this all spurred really from the National Archives and receiving the pop-up exhibit. And we do hope to have the libraries, the goal is starting on September 8th, the day after Labor Day. It's a Tuesday. We will start offering limited opening for computer usage only. So check with your local library to see what hours we're providing those. And so you'll at least be able to see the pop-up exhibit from a distance. So we're just being very careful in light of the virus. And also I wanted to tell you to please check out the Columbus Museum's website that Rebecca had listed, and also CSU libraries. There's a ton of information on there too. And feel free to also check out the public libraries, the Chattanooga Valley Library website again. And thank you to everyone here who presented with me, Rebecca Bush and Emily, and it's just been wonderful and educational. And thank you so much. Emily, did you have any last words?
Most of the updates that we have will be on our social media accounts. So you can keep a checkout on our events on our Instagram, it's CSU Libraries, Columbus State Libraries, and then our Facebook account, which is also Columbus State Libraries.
All right, awesome, most definitely. Thank you for mentioning that. And I also will say too that the public libraries, we are putting most of our virtual programming on Facebook and our YouTube pages. So please make sure that you follow us there if you haven't already done so. And it's under Chattahoochee Valley Libraries. So thank you so much everyone for watching today's program. And I'm going to go ahead and end the session.